Okay, so we're going to deal with Marsiglio of Padua today. What I'm going to try to do is just sort of cull out the larger significance of this piece. Hopefully it kind of surprised you a little bit to see somebody from this time period, from the 14th century, when the Catholic Church was really not being challenged in any really serious way, a physical way that is, to say some of the things that he says. In a part that you're not reading, he even recommends a change in church structure so that it's governed by a group of more or less elected clergy instead of the way that it is. So I think there's a lot of really kind of revolutionary ideas going on in Marsiglio's writing, and maybe you might imagine him as Luther before his time, or maybe Luther squared, because I think that he envisioned maybe even more change than Luther ended up doing. So the point that I want to make today through looking at his writing is that the Christian religion serves as this source of tension in the Western mind that leads to the development of some of the things that we're very, very familiar with today, such as freedom of conscience, which means, our freedom or right to believe what we want to believe, or not even, although I don't think too many people envisioned that being a major possibility back then. The separation of church and state, meaning the separation of those two into different spheres of responsibility. Okay, not necessarily disestablishment, because that didn't happen for a long time, in the sense that the government is not to pay for or sponsor anything like we mean it today, but the idea that the two institutions serve different functions, okay, and they shouldn't interfere with each other. The idea of sovereignty, who should be in charge of a jurisdiction, and should there be divided sovereignty? Well, Marsiglio and a lot of his supporters and the Holy Roman Emperor started to focus on the idea of sovereignty being absolute, not to be shared with another institution. And the whole idea of individual rights starts to emerge. You can see a glimmer of it here, the idea that individuals have a right to decide what they want to think, that they have a right to know who the authority is, and to not be caught up in a battle between two institutions and basically endure double jeopardy and things like that. So anyway, a lot of revolutionary ideas start coming out in Marsiglio's writing, and there are others like him throughout the Middle Ages, although he's probably one of the more vociferous ones, who raise these kind of issues, either for or against church authority. Okay? So you may have sort of gotten the impression that for a long period of time the church's authority was just unquestioned, and that's just not true. It's not true. It never has been unquestioned. And it was questioned all the way through the Middle Ages with varying results. Okay? The reason why, I think, one of the reasons that's not typically discussed, but which I think is very true, is that because of the idea behind Christianity, and really behind Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all three, is the idea that there's this authoritative book, okay, that exists. And it's this authoritative book that gives the religious institutions their authority. And whenever a text exists, some people are going to try to take a look at that text and think about it independently. Okay? Now, it was a little bit more difficult for a lot of people during the Middle Ages because a lot of them were either illiterate or unlearned in Latin. Okay? But the educated class was learned in Latin and could read it. And I think that you see in thinkers like Marsiglio, this independence comes from the independent resource. Okay? At least part of it comes from his ability to think, I can read this. Now, again, you may have been taught, well, this only is something that happened during the Protestant Reformation, But that's not true either. As long as that text has been there, there's always been this separate source of information, and this notion that the institutions need to come from that source. And so there's this immediate tension between the source and the institutions. And do the institutions measure up? Okay? So that is a very important part, I think. And then, of course, you have this inevitable desire for power and control. And during the Middle Ages, you have not only the church and the state, but you have within the state multiple layers of authority competing for power. The king, the prince, the barons, and the lower level aristocracy, the people with the arms, okay? And so there's all this, these different sets of interests all competing for power. And of course, two of the biggest are the top level of government and the church. The church claiming it had authority to basically decide who would be in charge, and the people in charge not liking and resisting that claim. Okay? So all that surrounds Marsiglio's story, because he was on the side of the secular authority having the ultimate say. His work is entitled The Defender of the Peace. Who is the defender of the peace ultimately for Marsiglio? Did you get that? Is it the Pope? Is it the king? Marsiglio is not a member of the clergy. Okay? He's not a priest. Okay. The defender of the peace, it turns out for him, is actually the Holy Roman Emperor. And though the title may be misleading, this was an authority that was elected by members of the aristocracy in the Holy Roman Empire. So the defender is not the Pope, but the king, so to speak. Okay? And he spends a lot of time in this work building that argument. Okay? Now, the Pope would obviously claim to be the defender of the peace because he has the definition of peace. And the definition of peace, from the Pope's perspective, would be, the rule of Christ through the church. That's the bringer of peace. Okay? So with Marsiglio, you get this idea that peace comes from the secular authority, from its ability to have the sovereignty within its territory, to defend, its laws, to enforce them. Marsiglio was an Italian, but he resided in France. He was the rector of the University of Paris. That's basically like our President Schultz, and he was not a member of the clergy. He was actually trained as a medical person. But he had a lot of political ideas. He was very, very interested and very much against the church's authority as it then existed. Okay? And this was well before, I want to say, about 200 years before the Protestant Reformation. Okay? And his ideas, like many others before and after him, because they didn't go along with the church's authority, were labeled heretical. He had committed heresy. Okay. Now, this gets a little complicated, so I will go slowly. It's important to understand the background story here of what was going on and why this guy became so important. This manuscript he wrote while he was in Paris, and at first he distributed it anonymously, but there's no such thing as anonymity. People found out who had authored this, and when they found out, and the Pope found out, then he had to leave, and leave fast, and he sought asylum with the Holy Roman Emperor, who resided in Bavaria, okay? Ludwig. Why? Because Ludwig was already in a quarrel with the Pope, and he knew that he could get protection from him, because basically Ludwig agreed with him. They agreed with each other about where the authority should lie and who should have the ultimate authority within a territory. Okay? The Holy Roman Empire at this time was pretty big. It comprised Germany, Italy, parts of Austria, Switzerland, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Okay? So these various areas would basically elect the emperor. Okay? And so, as I said, the Holy Roman Emperor had been involved in this conflict with Pope John. And another complication was that the papacy at this point was in France, okay, at Avignon. And you may have heard of this, or you've heard of the Great Schism. How many of you have heard of this? Okay. So the schism occurred when, towards the end of the papacies that were in Avignon, the Pope moved back to Italy, but 2 more popes were elected in Avignon, so you had 2 popes at the same time, both claiming legitimacy. Okay? So, anyway, John was in France, and all of the popes during this period of time were French. Okay? There were 7 of them elected. Okay? And the conflict was over who should be the Holy Roman Emperor. The Pope had supported somebody else, Frederick, for that title instead of Ludwig. Okay? And they were at odds with each other. Okay? And part of the reason for this was Ludwig had also, already voiced his opposition to being ruled by the Pope. Okay? You with me so far? All right. So you can imagine that some people respond to the papal authority better than others. Some people's response was to sort of play both ends against the middle, so to speak. But Ludwig was somebody who honestly was rather honest about his point of view and rejected the Pope's authority, and he resented that. Okay? This is just a little bit about the schism in the Avignon papacy. It lasted about 70 years. And through 7 popes. And during this time, the French kings had more influence, as you might imagine, and tried to get more and more influence over the papacy. Okay. So Gregory XI decided to return to Rome, and I think part of the reason was he wanted the independence. Okay? But, as it says there, 2 more popes were still elected in Avignon, which are referred to as anti-popes, okay? Because the legitimate papacy, as the church understands it, was in Italy, okay? So that lasted until 1417, when the last Avignon pope, I think, died. So a very complicated period of time, not one that a lot of people know about. And so that added to the tension, because there was even more politicization of the whole issue of the papacy at this time. The French were happy to have it there as long as they could use it for their own purposes. The papacy wanted its own authority, so they had problems with the French kings as well. All right? So the Pope refused to recognize Ludwig as the Holy Roman Emperor because it preferred somebody else. And Ludwig became Marsiglio's patron. Okay, that's important. And it was because they were fellow travelers, because they both agreed about the authority of the papacy being too much, too dictatorial. As a result, Pope John charged Marsiglio with heresy. Okay? But Marsiglio was safe because he wasn't anywhere where the Pope could get him. But nevertheless, he was excommunicated. And then he also excommunicated Ludwig. And Ludwig ignored him. Okay. So he was elected Holy Roman Emperor in despite of the fact, and imagine what this means. It means that not only did Ludwig personally ignore the church's position, but also all of the electors ignored the church's position. Okay? So this is quite a little rebellion we have here, and it would have It would have emboldened people like Marsiglio, who would have felt rather safe. He was safe because of the power of the empire to be able to protect him during this time, so he could now, say what he wanted to say. All right, everybody still with me? Okay. So you see, the times were very ripe for somebody like Marsiglio to write. Okay. Things were a little up for grabs at this time. And you may remember from, I think all of you that are here today were in my class, Intro to Political Thought, where we dealt with Machiavelli. But if you weren't, maybe you have learned this from some other professor. In the 16th century, things were somewhat different, but not that different. The Protestant Reformation was going to happen in that century, but the tensions had built up. And do you remember what Machiavelli had to say about the papacy in Italy and what kind of effect it had on the Italians? Remember, the Italians were divided, and it wasn't a united country.
Yeah, he wanted to create the nation state of Italy.
Mm-hmm.
Make it unified.
Right. Machiavelli wanted that nation state. He wanted to unify Italy. And how did he see the church in that picture? Was it helpful? No. Because he said it had just enough power to be able to divide people with its own agenda of trying to control various principalities, but not enough power to do the unification itself. Okay? So he saw it as more of a problem than a solution, and sort of standing in the way. Also, he was affected, obviously, by the church's corruption at his time. Led him into a lot of cynicism as well. Okay. So Machiavelli was rather boldly and openly critical of the church. He treated the church as a political institution. And he didn't think that it played a positive role, but rather a negative role in keeping Italy divided. So Marsiglio is maybe a little bit earlier Machiavelli too, but he's not as cynical as Machiavelli. I think Marsiglio feels that he is a very firm Christian. Okay? So that's why he reminds me a little bit more of Luther. He thinks he's a very firm Christian, and he is critical of the church because he doesn't think it goes along with his view of Christianity. Okay? Towards the end of the piece you have, he even goes so far as to say that he's gotten information from above, directly from God, in other words, to inform his criticism of the church and his views about who should be in charge. Okay? Then that's pretty unusual for the times. This idea that, again, we were taught, Luther came up with this idea of direct inspiration, but actually direct inspiration happens whenever somebody decides that they're going to sort of take independent notice of the text and decide to, have ideas of their own, and that can happen whenever it's available. Okay, so we see Marsiglio kind of starting out slowly. Machiavelli was very bold in his assertions about the church and about government. And Marsiglio gets more bold as time goes by, but the first thing he says could leave you kind of wondering what he's talking about. So I wanted to cover this fairly carefully. On page 176, he says this: although there are many primary causes of discord, and there are not a few interconnections among them, which are capable of occurring in the normal manner, almost all were described by the distinguished philosopher in the civil science. And by the way, I'm not sure if he's referring there to politics, if he's referring to some other work, I'm not sure what it is. He does refer to politics later in this piece, so it would seem like it's a separate work, but I'm not sure about that, okay? But the way he writes makes me think it's another term for the politics, because it seems like he gets everything out of it. He says, yet there is a certain additional, unique, and extremely obscure cause for discord, which has long burdened the Roman Empire, and burdens it still, one which is never less than highly contagious, and is inclined to spread slowly into all cities and kingdoms, and has already attempted in its covetousness to invade most of them. And the origins and character of this could have been perceived neither by Aristotle nor by other philosophers of his time or earlier. For this cause is and was a certain perverted opinion to be explicated subsequently by us, occasioned as the result of a miraculous effect, and then in parentheses, produced by the supreme cause beyond the possibilities of inferior nature and the normal actions of causes and physical objects, which occurred long after the time of Aristotle. Okay, maybe I should stop here. I'll put this up on the screen. Whoa, what am I doing? Okay. So this is the paragraph in question. And let's just look at this. He says, for this cause, the cause of discord in the Roman Empire, is and was a certain perverted opinion to be explicated subsequently by us, occasioned as the result of a miraculous effect produced by a supreme cause, which occurred long after the time of Aristotle. Anybody have any idea what he's talking about? That's pretty obscure. He really seems to be trying to make it obscure. He's not being direct, which is it's a mode of writing that's employed when people are a little bit afraid of persecution. Okay? They try to soften and make a little bit obscure what they say so that it can be interpreted in a variety of ways. Anybody have a guess?
Jesus and the establishment of the church.
Yeah, there's the miraculous effect. Okay? Now, I don't think he's questioning the original establishment of the church. I know he's not. Okay? Because he later says he's not. Okay? So he's not questioning Jesus' authority, the miraculous nature of Jesus, or his giving the church originally to St. Peter. Okay? But rather he does question later on all the other people that, the papal succession. Okay? He does question that. But what he does here is he basically leaps to, the church was created as a result of this miraculous effect, which did occur after Aristotle. Okay, but it created this institution, which he then refers to as the sophism. What's that?
Isn't that is like a philosophy that Plato was responding to, maybe? No.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and it's like there's no truth, basically, kind of, or that you can use rhetoric to get what you want.
Yep, this is coming from the Platonic perspective. So sophism is a pejorative. It's a bad word in this view. It does come from his reading of Plato, Aristotle as well, and the view that the sophists created lies, that they used language to deceive people. So when he calls something a sophism, that's a pretty strong criticism. And the implication, though it's not directly spelled out there, is that the institution created by this miraculous effect became a sophism. He doesn't explain exactly, how at all here. It's just an implication. So he leaps to calling it that. And so if you make the connection, if you really understand what he's talking about, it's a very, very strong criticism and a pretty bold thing to say. And realize that somebody saying this has, whether they are charged with heresy or not, basically put themselves outside the protection and the benefits of the Catholic Church. Okay? So from the point on of saying that, he's excommunicated himself. So this is somebody who doesn't he does not mind that, probably because he sincerely does not believe that. Okay? So he says this sophism, wearing an honorable and useful face, is wholly pernicious and is damaging, harmful to the human species and to all civil bodies and countries. If it is not restrained, it will ultimately beget unbearable injuries. Very, very strong language there. So, I mean, definitely you could read this and not know what the heck he's talking about, okay? But if you know where he's coming from, and especially the more that you read, you realize where he's coming from. He's saying something really, really controversial here. He's saying something very, very strong. And you can see why he originally wanted to be anonymous. Because not only, he may not have worried about being excommunicated spiritually, but you might have some pretty serious political and social problems being this strongly critical of the church without having the power of somebody like the Holy Roman Emperor behind you to protect you. So when he fled, he got that. Okay? So notice that he uses Aristotle as the authority. So very much in line with a lot of other medieval thinkers, Aristotle is the secular authority, and since he doesn't have the church as the spiritual authority, Aristotle becomes very much the authority. Unlike Aquinas, who tried to combine the two, Marsiglio chooses, okay? And it's Aristotle and his interpretation of Aristotle. On the next page, he refers to Ludwig, the emperor, as God's minister, okay? What does that tell you about his view of God and of political authority? Well, what would the Pope have to say about that?
Wouldn't like it.
No, he would not. He's God's minister, right? So, yes, this is, at a certain point, Marsiglio reminds me also of Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes said the same thing. He said, the king is God's minister because the king has the earthly authority to carry out, the whatever laws he wants. He's put here because God puts everything into place. He had to have put the king in place, okay? And just like Hobbes, Marsiglio argues that you can't have divided authority. It's got to be in one place, particularly probably in one person. Okay, so after this, Marsiglio goes into a pretty long explanation about how civil society is created. Remember that? It sounds like directly out of the politics. You should be very familiar with this argument by now because it seems like so many of these people just recreate it. Okay, the society between man and woman, family, servants. It grows to a village, to the city-state, and pretty soon he's talking about the proper role of citizens. Okay, and that the state is there for the citizen, okay? And the proper role of the citizen is to rule and be ruled in turn, straight out of Aristotle, okay? So its origins lie, just like for Aristotle, in our social nature. He claims that we're social and political creatures, okay? Now you might think this will mean that Marsiglio is going to endorse polity like Aristotle, but what he does is he sort of fudges a little bit here, okay? He takes the system that exists in the Holy Roman Empire, where high-level elites elect the emperor, and basically tries to show this reflects the Aristotelian view that, citizens need to rule and be ruled in turn. Those people are legitimate rulers within their territories. They represent the people. They elect the emperor, okay? So it loosely reflects Aristotle's vision, but not really, okay? But it is an assertion that ultimately the people are in charge. Ultimately, the authority lies with the people. He does say that. It's just that the system through which it works is not what you would call democratic, okay? So he defines citizenship as free men who take part in ruling. He says political authority lies in the people, or, quote, the more dominant part of them. And that's the way it was. Okay. So the more dominant part of the people represented the people. Okay. And then he asks the question, what happens if this truth is ignored and you have two opposing authorities making decisions for people? Okay? Namely, although he doesn't immediately say it, but obviously he's talking about the church and the state. Okay? What kind of complications can arise when both of these institutions claim to have authority over the same types of things, like what we witnessed last week with taxation? Both the church and the state claim to be able to ask people to pay taxes to support them. Okay? Or over certain behavior to define what's criminal and to prosecute it. What kind of problems can that cause?
It seems like you would have a division, like people would take sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is what's happening here. Yeah, because if if you're basically subject to two authorities and they oppose each other, then it almost forces you to take sides, doesn't it? If you want to try to defend yourself, protect yourself. Any other problems you can see coming from this?
Violence.
Yeah.
If people are forced to take sides, eventually there might be conflicts.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You'd end up potentially with civil wars or other wars, right? Another effect, which is a little bit more subtle, is just uncertainty, which many thinkers, from that point on, pointed out, creates a lack of productivity. When you don't know for sure what the rules are, Machiavelli made this point very clearly, then you're much less likely to do anything, the making of contracts, undertaking your own private business, getting an education. Very serious decisions that you have to make in an atmosphere of uncertainty, where you don't know what's going to be rewarded and what's going to be punished. Okay? So it discourages people from enterprise. It discourages people from taking the initiative, and that makes society stagnate. All right? So this is one of the many reasons why people say we have to make a decision. We have to decide who's really in charge here. Okay? But you're right that one of the biggest issues was just safety. As long as this question is undecided, we're going to have war, we're going to have conflict. And there's also the issue of just pure fairness. I mean, everybody understands the unfairness of being subject to competing jurisdictions, both claiming to be supreme. Okay? And that's partly what draws out this notion of rights in people. That, well, wait a minute, I'm an individual. What are my rights? Well, this institution says I can do this, and that institution says I can do that. What do I think? It kind of begs that type of questioning. Okay, so Marsiglio has to answer this question. And I think you already kind of know what he's going to answer, what his answer is going to be, but it's interesting how he gets there. Let's see, he points out the unfairness aspect of it on page 189. Okay. For instance, for him, it might be the state says it's okay to write these things, the church says it's not. The state claims to protect me, but if the church gets to me, it can burn me at the stake. Okay? So he says on page 189, we shall first show this in the following way. If there were to be many ruling bodies in the city or kingdom, and it was not guided by or ordered under some supreme one, the execution of judgments, commands, and matters of advantage and justice would cease. And as a result of this, there would be fighting, division, and ultimately the disintegration of the city or kingdom. Okay? So ultimately that's the danger, is dissolution, revolution, etc. Okay? Down below he says about being maybe tried twice or being judged differently in different jurisdictions. He says, moreover, it may be that, although impossible, one is called to be present at the courts of many rulers, and one says nothing about or responds to different charges at the same time, yet perhaps that person will be condemned by one ruling body while absolved of the same crime by another, or if one is condemned by both, they do not do so in the same fashion. Okay? So there's just a logic to it. There's a lack of order here. Okay? So we get this question, where does your allegiance really lie? A couple of other passages he uses to illustrate this problem. On 190, under 5, he says, once again, from this there would occur the division and opposition, fighting and separation of citizens, ultimately the dissolution of the city, some people wishing to obey one ruling body while others wishing to obey another. Likewise, conflict would occur between ruling bodies themselves on account of the fact that each one of them will wish to be superior to the others. Besides, the ruling bodies will wish to subject citizens resisting them, and furthermore, the above-mentioned obstacles would arise from the dissension between the ruling bodies or their mutual competition in the absence of a superior judge. Okay, that's pretty clear. Okay. All sorts of problems that basically paralyze society and slow it down. And on 191, under 8, he says, furthermore, just as in the arrangement of the animal, this is where he uses the body politic image, just as in the arrangement of the animal, there is one primary source directing and moving it as regards changes of location, as is evident in the book On the Movements of Animals by Aristotle. Since should there be several sources of leadership, and should contrary or different motions be directed simultaneously, it would be necessary for the animal either to be carried in contrary directions or to remain entirely immobilized, and hence to be deprived of those things which are procured for its needs and benefit by means of movement. So the same is the case for the suitably ordered civil body, which we have said in chapter 15 has characteristics analogous to an animal well formed according to nature. Now, so just as the brain, decides how the body's going to move, okay, so one authority needs to decide how the civil society is going to live. Okay? And when you have two, you have paralysis, or you have movement that basically doesn't lead to any good result. Okay? So it's a nice image to show the irrationality that he sees when there's a conflict between authorities. Okay? Hobbes said, quoting the Bible, man cannot serve two masters. And he uses it to basically argue for the supremacy of the civil authority. And he goes further than Marsiglio in basically saying that the church needs to come under the authority of the state. Okay? What Marsiglio ends up doing is saying that the church needs to just deal with spiritual matters and needs to be governed differently. And the state needs to be in charge of civil matters, political matters. Okay? So he didn't quite go so far as Hobbes, but he's certainly motivated by the same spirit. And Hobbes basically said, the king, sovereign in his own territory, is put there by God, is ultimately God's minister, and the church comes under his authority. Okay? So Marsiglio is a little bit of a Hobbesian. All right, so we've sort of already answered this question, but Marsiglio does eventually get around to just calling it what it is, and he says the church is the source of this division in his view, okay? And the church has gone wrong by asserting temporal authority. In other words, it's gone wrong by saying it has authority over worldly things, okay? That it can do things like taxing people, or that it can tell people what they can and cannot write about, okay? Or they can tell, the most pertinent case, that the church can tell the people who's a legitimate ruler and who isn't, okay? So he says when the church decides to rule in these worldly matters, that it's overstepping its bounds, okay? And that he acknowledges it was given spiritual authority. That's what it has. All right? But it has not stuck to simply the spiritual authority. So what kind of things would fall under spiritual authority?
Maybe to teach God's word or teach the scriptures.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely teaching people the teachings of Christ and, the biblical truths. Okay? That he doesn't dispute the church's role in forgiveness of sins, actually. Okay? He doesn't even directly dispute the church's ability to excommunicate people. Okay? These are spiritual matters. But when the church decides to say, no, you can't be king because you disagree with us, this is where it oversteps its bounds. Okay? And where it inevitably creates this division. Because ultimately the church, though it was more powerful then than it is now by far, didn't have the power to be able to enforce those decisions, okay, other than through spiritual means, okay, by threatening excommunication and so forth. So there's a lot of territory in the spiritual authority that's left to the church. Okay? Now, that would seem to be a little bit of a concession to say that the church does have quite a bit of authority, and I think it is. In other words, he could have gone farther, like Hobbes did, and basically say the church is a wing of the state, and ultimately only gets authority from the secular leader. Okay? But he doesn't do that. However, what he does do is maybe more amazing. He does question apostolic succession, and he suggests that the church would be better ruled, and be more of a spiritual authority if it was ruled differently than it is. Okay. So this is where he sounds particularly Protestant. Let's see, on page 196, towards the bottom of the page, he says, certain bishops following after him, referring to St. Peter, in the apostolic or episcopal seat of Rome, particularly after the time of Constantine, emperor of the Romans, claim and assert themselves to be in command of all the other bishops and presbyters in the world in regard to all types of jurisdictional authority. And some of the more recent of them claim not only this, but also jurisdiction over all the rulers, communities, and individual persons of the world. Although they do not express this so equivocally, nor state it so explicitly with regard to everyone as with regard to the ruler called the Emperor of the Romans, and all the provinces and cities and persons subjected to him. In accordance with the truth, however, the expression of the singular lordship or coercive jurisdiction over this ruler would seem to have received an initial shape and support from a certain edict and donation, which some people say was made by Constantine to the Roman pontiff, St. Sylvester. So he's disputing, in other words, that, is everybody clear on what the apostolic succession is? Okay, so every pope after Peter, okay, until we get to that schism, which he's writing before, okay, was considered to be legitimately the pope. That authority passed on from the previous pope, okay. So he's disputing something very, very fundamental to the church's structure, and that it would have considered essential to its authority, because from its perspective, the authority came straight from the authority given by Jesus to the original leader of the church. Okay? So he continues, still, because that donation or privilege did not hold this clearly, or since it has perhaps expired as a result of later occurrences, or even because, although being valid, the force of that privilege or concession did not extend to the other ruling bodies of the world, nor to that of the Romans in all of its provinces. Thus afterwards the more recent bishops of Rome have assumed also for themselves this coercive jurisdiction over the whole world with a certain all-encompassing title, namely plenitude of power, which they assert to have been conceded by Christ to St. Peter and his successors in the Roman episcopal seat as the vicars of Christ. So he disputes that. Okay? And that's certainly heretical in the extreme. Okay? And can you see why he does this? Okay? I mean, it's partly political in that if he can dispute the succession, then the institution of the church loses some of its authority. Okay? It becomes less, its claim to have authority over worldly leaders becomes less compelling. Okay? If the succession of popes is simply a matter of who happened to be in the right place at the right time and is basically a human process, then the papacy has less authority. Okay? And so that's part of it. And then there's just this skepticism that he's expressing here, which becomes, I mean, this reminds me so much of Locke's first treatise of government, much later, where he writes about actually the spiritual authority of kings and questions that along the same lines. He wants the church to be ruled in a different fashion than this. So he goes even further than expressing skepticism about this process to actually, I don't have it here, but actually he proposes that the church be ruled by some sort of elected council of bishops or priests. Okay? So he really, I mean, that's close to the Protestant view of how a church should be run. Okay? The Protestants rejected apostolic succession. Okay? And of course, a lot of them had local rule, and elders and people in the church in charge. But they didn't have this notion that, authority came from above. It came from below. It was more democratic. Okay? And so he kind of leans in that direction. And that's pretty astounding coming from the 14th century. So you can see how these ideas and these criticisms and these tensions just kept boiling until you get to the Protestant Reformation. But, I mean, it's these that create the stew from which liberal ideology emerges. Okay? It's not just Martin Luther and one event in time. It's the whole history of the church in Europe and the political institutions and the rivalries they had with each other. And the whole existence of the Christian religion in Europe generally, which gives people, on the one hand, the church as an institution, but on the other hand, this notion that, one needs to understand God's will, and God's will can be found in this book, okay? And the possibility that what's in that book and what's being played out on the historical scene clashes, okay? To me, the whole thing is inevitable, okay? It's inevitable whenever you have a separate source of truth apart from what human beings are telling you. And it shaped a lot of our world today.